3 weeks. That was how long Verity Ashworth had been telling herself she would find a way to renegotiate the arrangement before it became something she could not undo. 3 weeks of rising before the household stirred, of working through columns of figures by lamplight, of rehearsing conversations she would eventually need to have with solicitors who had already decided what she was worth and found the sum negligible. 3 weeks of watching the candles burn lower in the drawing room of Ashworth Park while she made her uncle's decisions and was given none of the credit for making them. The night it changed was a Tuesday in the last week of November 1819, and it began the way most things of consequence began in her life, without ceremony. She was at the small writing desk in the estate's morning room, positioned at the exact edge of what the candlelight could reach, when the footman announced that there were carriages on the drive. Not one carriage, 3. The sound of them, wheels on gravel, horses held to a collected halt, arrived before the announcement did, and Verity had already straightened in her chair and set down her pen before the footman finished his sentence. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like advance warning. Her uncle, Sir Mortimer Ashworth, was hosting what he called an informal dinner. She had organized it in its entirety: the menu, the placement of covers, the decanting schedule for the wine, the arrangement of the winter greens from the glasshouse, the pressing of 3 tablecloths because the footman had put an iron crease in the first 2. She had done all of this before noon and spent the afternoon correcting the household accounts, which were 18 months behind, and showed 2 discrepancies she suspected were not innocent errors. She was not invited to the dinner. She was not expected in the room. She was, in her uncle's household, the person who built the engine and was never permitted near the carriage. And at the edge of all that candlelit arrangement, seated at the morning room desk with ink on her second finger and a draft contract clause folded under her left hand, was Verity Ashworth. She was 28 years old. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense the season required, but her face was precise, and her attention was complete, and anyone who had watched her for more than 10 minutes would have noticed that she noticed everything. She wore a gray dress she had worn twice before and repaired at the left cuff herself, and she wore it without apology. Through the drawing-room wall she heard laughter, and then the unmistakable sound of a room being entered by someone who was not performing entrance. Most people of rank arrived in a drawing-room. The opening of the doors was their signal, and they walked through it the way actors take a stage. What she heard now was different. A single set of footsteps, measured, deliberate, without hurry. The laughter did not increase when he entered. It paused. She did not look up from her accounts. She did hear, sometime later, when the dinner had begun and the morning room was quiet and dark beyond her single lamp. The footman passed the door again, and she heard him say, to someone in the corridor, that His Grace the Duke of Crestwood had attended in person this evening, which had not been expected. His Grace, Verity noted, returning to her ledger column. Not his secretary, not his land agent, the Duke himself. She pressed her pen back to the paper and continued. She had been 9 years old when her father died. This was the fact from which everything else descended. He had been a barrister of modest competence and considerable warmth, and he had left behind him a wife who loved him, 2 daughters, the lease on a house in Ipswich, and, because he had been modest in his competence, no estate, no capital, and no plan for what would happen next. Her mother had managed for 3 years on the remaining lease payments and then, with quiet efficiency, had arranged for Verity to go to her father's brother, Sir Mortimer, in Suffolk, and for her younger sister to go to a maternal aunt in Bath. It was not abandonment. Verity understood this, even then. It was mathematics. Her mother could not maintain 2 daughters on what remained. She sent them where there was shelter. Verity had arrived at Ashworth Park at 12 years old with a trunk, a facility for arithmetic that her late father had encouraged, and the absolute understanding that she was there on terms, not on affection. Sir Mortimer's wife, Aunt Helena, had been kind in the way of women who are kind to furniture, reliably, impersonally. She had put Verity in a room in the East Wing, arranged for her to take lessons with the estate's clergyman, and otherwise considered the matter settled. What had not been considered was what would happen when Aunt Helena died 5 years later, and Sir Mortimer found himself in possession of a large estate, a disorganized set of accounts, an upcoming harvest negotiation with 3 creditors, and a 17-year-old niece who had been quietly managing the household linen inventory since she was 14, because the housekeeper had asked her to help, and she had never stopped. Sir Mortimer was not a cruel man. He was a man of a particular type, of the kind who could look directly at capable work being done, and not register that it required a person to do it. He had handed Verity the household accounts one afternoon, as one might hand someone a parcel to hold for a moment, while one adjusted one's hat, and then he had never quite taken them back. By the time she was 20, Verity was managing the estate correspondence. By 22, she had renegotiated the Ashworth wool contract with the Yorkshire merchant and recovered £40 per annum that had been quietly hemorrhaging through a clause her uncle had not noticed. By 24, she had identified and resolved a dispute with the Northern Tenant Farms that had been simmering for 8 years. She had done all of this from the morning room desk, without title, without credit in any legal document, and without a salary, because the understanding had never been formalized. She had a room, she had meals, she had the morning room and its accounts and, by now, a working knowledge of estate management that would have been remarkable in a man twice her age and properly educated. She did not have a name for what she was doing. The law did not have one either. There had been one moment, she was 23, in March, with the creditor papers spread across the morning room desk in a letter that would save or lose 2 tenant families depending on how she phrased the next paragraph, when she had sat for exactly 4 minutes and thought about what it would mean to simply leave. She had considered it with precision, where she would go, what she could claim, whether the Ipswich house still existed. She had calculated the odds of finding respectable employment as a governess or a housekeeper, had assessed her age and her references and her position. Then she had picked up her pen and finished the letter. She was not going to step aside for anyone, least of all for the version of herself that wanted to give up. The moment that changed things, that started the mechanism that would bring 3 carriages to the drive on a Tuesday in November, had happened 6 months before that evening, and Verity had not known she was part of it. She had been playing the pianoforte. This was unusual. The instrument had belonged to Aunt Helena and had sat in the East drawing room, largely unplayed since her death. Verity had taught herself from Helena's old instruction books, practicing in the early mornings when the house was quiet and no one would find it peculiar. She was not a trained musician, but she had a quality that training alone does not produce. She played with the full attention of a person who had learned that most valuable things require precision, and she played Helena's old sheet music with a feeling that was less performance than conversation. What she had not known, in June, was that there had been a visitor, a man she had not seen, who had arrived in the late evening on an unrelated matter, the renewal of an agricultural drainage easement that ran through Ashworth's southern field and a neighboring estate to the north. He had been shown into the main hall to wait, and the east drawing room was just adjacent, and the door had been left open. He had stood in the hall and listened for 12 minutes without announcing himself. Then he had concluded his business with Sir Mortimer's secretary and departed. She had not known any of this. Julian Ashford, the 7th Duke of Crestwood, was not accustomed to changing his mind about anything quickly. He had been changing it about this for 6 months, which, by his own accounting, was not quickly at all. It was deliberate. It was methodical. It was the decision-making process of a man who had made several decisions in haste and understood precisely what those had cost. He was 34 years old. He had held the dukedom since he was 19, when his father had died of a prolonged illness that had also consumed the estate's remaining liquid capital and most of its reliable income. He had spent the 15 years since reconstructing the financial foundation of Crestwood with the focused intensity of a man who has no choice and has chosen to have no feelings about that fact. He had succeeded. The estate's income was now 4 times what it had been in his father's last year. The reconstruction had taken everything he had, what it had left behind, in the place where a different man might have kept an openness to the ordinary rhythms of human connection, was a very precise and total understanding of competence. Julian recognized it the way a builder recognizes a well-constructed arch, not with emotion, but with the immediate structural certainty that this will hold. He had sent his inquiry agent to Ashworth in July. The report arrived in 3 weeks and ran to 11 pages. He read it twice. The second time, he made notes in the margins. The report documented 6 years of estate management at Ashworth Park by the niece of Sir Mortimer Ashworth, all of it unpaid, all of it informal, none of it legally attributed. It documented the recovered wool contract margin, the resolved tenant dispute, the renegotiated drainage agreement that bore her uncle's signature and her reasoning. It documented that the Ashworth household accounts had been kept without error for 4 consecutive years, which was a fact the inquiry agent had confirmed by requesting the Ashworth ledgers under the pretext of a separate assessment. The accounts were not merely accurate, they showed a structural intelligence in how losses had been tracked and reversed, a pattern the agent had noted as unusual for any estate manager, let alone an uncredentialed one. The report's final page contained a personal observation, which the inquiry agent had added in smaller script, as though uncertain whether it was relevant. He noted that on the day he had visited the estate under pretext, he had been briefly in the morning room awaiting the secretary, and that he had observed Miss Ashworth at her desk for approximately 4 minutes. He wrote, "She did not look up once, though she was clearly aware of my presence, and she completed 2 full columns of calculation before I was shown out." Julian had looked at that paragraph for a long time. He had attended Sir Mortimer's dinner in November because he had received the invitation, and because the drainage easement needed a follow-up discussion, and because he wanted, with the controlled precision that governed every decision he made, to see her in the room where she worked, not to speak to her, not yet, only to see whether what he had constructed in his mind from 11 pages of report corresponded with anything real. He had been shown into the drawing room, and she had not been there. The room held Sir Mortimer and 6 other guests, including a Miss Elaine Whitmore, who was the daughter of a Northamptonshire baronet, and who had been, according to Julian's social awareness, positioned in his vicinity at 4 separate gatherings in the past year, with a consistency that was less coincidental than organized. Elaine Whitmore was beautiful and accomplished and the product of exactly the system that produced women to be dukes' wives. She played the pianoforte with polish. She spoke with elegance. She understood how to manage a social occasion and was not troubled by that understanding. She had been waiting for this evening's conversation, Julian could see, with a patience that had been carefully maintained. He respected her strategy without being moved by it. He had engaged in the required conversations for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Then he had asked Sir Mortimer, quietly, whether there was somewhere private he might review the drainage easement paperwork before the matter was raised at the table, because he preferred to see the documents in advance. Sir Mortimer, who was a man of the type who responds immediately to the quiet authority of a duke, had offered his morning room. He had entered the morning room and found her there. She had looked up. She had assessed him in the way of someone who has been interrupted mid-calculation and intends to return to it as soon as possible. She had said, "I'll take the ledgers with me. I apologize. I was not told the room would be needed." He had said, "Stay," not because he had planned to say that, because it was what he meant. She had stayed. He had not reviewed the easement papers. He had looked at her desk, which was covered in organized papers with a system of marking that he recognized as efficient. He had said, "Is that the wool contract?" She had said, "The quarter report on it, yes." He had said, "The recovered margin. Was the original clause a drafting error, or was it deliberately underspecified?" She had been still for a moment. Then she had said, "Deliberately, I think. The merchant's solicitor would not have inserted it by accident. But I couldn't prove intent, only result, so I argued on the result." He had looked at her for a long moment. He had not said anything he intended to say next. Instead, he had said, "I'll need you to come to Crestwood." She had been very still. Then she had said, "I'm sorry." He had said, "There is a position, an estate management position. I'll have my solicitor draw the terms." She had thought about this with the unhurried completeness of someone who does not say yes to things she has not assessed. Then she had said, "I would want to see the terms before I agreed to anything." He had said, "Of course." He had left the morning room. He had not returned to the drawing room dinner. He had sent his apologies through his secretary, stepped into his carriage, and made the 3-hour journey back to Crestwood in the dark. He did not examine, on that journey, what had just occurred. He simply held it. Like a stone dropped into still water, he did not need to watch the rings spread to know the distance they would travel. The document that arrived at Ashworth Park 4 days later was 8 pages. Verity read it 3 times. On the first reading, she looked for traps. On the second reading, she identified them. There were 2 clauses that were overspecified to the point of being restrictive, one regarding the estate account authority and one regarding correspondence on behalf of the estate. On the third reading, she made her annotations. She wrote back with a single page of revisions. She did not apologize for the revisions. She stated them as corrections to the document's intent, which was, she assumed, mutual benefit, and she offered specific alternative language for each clause. The response came in 2 days. It was the original document, reissued, with her language incorporated without exception. She had held that document for a long time. She had not experienced, in some years, the particular sensation of having a thing she had said heard completely. She packed 2 trunks, arranged with the estate's remaining housekeeper a handover of the Ashworth accounts, and presented herself at Crestwood Hall on a Wednesday in December. Crestwood Hall was a Palladian house of considerable size, and it had been built for permanence, which it had achieved. It stood 3 stories above a wide gravel approach, its stone facade the particular gray-white of chalk hills, its windows regular and tall. It was a house that communicated nothing so much as the expectation that it would be here a very long time, and that any question about this would be misplaced. Verity stepped down from the hired carriage and looked at it with the assessment of someone who was calculating, before anything else, whether it was as large as it appeared. It was. The housekeeper who met her at the door was Mrs. Bramley, a woman of about 50, solid and unhurried, whose welcome was specific and warm. She said, "You'll be Miss Ashworth. I'm very glad you've come. The estate books for the Eastern tenancies have been needing a proper eye for 14 months, and I've been saying so to anyone who would listen." She had taken Verity's coat and handed it to a footman and said, "The accounts room is on the 1st floor. I'll show you in the morning. Tonight you'll want supper and rest." It was the first practical welcome Verity had received in a long time, and she received it without remark, which was how she received everything she valued. She did not see Julian that evening. She was shown to rooms in the East Wing, comfortable, well-maintained, with a fire already laid, and she was given supper on a tray, and she spent the last hour before sleeping reading the summary she had been sent of the Eastern tenancy situation. She made 3 notes in the margin. She met him the following morning in the estate library, which was also where, it became apparent, he conducted the serious business of running the estate. He was standing at a large table when she entered. Several maps and one open ledger spread before him. He was in his waistcoat only. The tailcoat was draped over the chair behind him, and his attention was so thoroughly on the ledger that he had not heard her enter, which she suspected was unusual for a man of his contained precision. She said, "The Eastern tenancy drainage problem is the same problem as the wool contract. Structurally, the benefit has been flowing in one direction by means of a poorly specified agreement. The question is whether the errors are accumulative or deliberate." He had looked up. His attention settled on her in the particular way she had noticed in the morning room. Direct, assessing, and not performing interest. He said, "Show me." She pulled the summary from under her arm and laid it on the table beside the ledger, and told him what she had seen in 26 pages of documentation in the course of one evening's reading. She was specific. She cited the figures. He did not interrupt. He asked 3 questions, all of which she answered, and then he stood back from the table and looked at the mapped drainage layout for a long moment and said, "There's a 4th issue you haven't mentioned." She said, "The Millstream diversion from 1803. I was going to mention it second, after we'd established the framework, because it changes the legal picture." He had looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not, precisely, classify. It was not surprise. It was something older than that, and quieter, like the recognition of a form that has been searched for and found in an unexpected place. He said, "I'll review your notes this afternoon. We should meet again tomorrow." She said, "Yes." She picked up her summary. He had, she noticed, already written one marginal annotation, and returned to the accounts room. She had managed creditors in 2 counties. She had survived 8 years of being the invisible person who kept a household standing. She could manage this. The Crestwood household was not unwelcoming, but it was a large and structured world, and its structure had opinions. Mrs. Bramley made her welcome immediately and without condition. The young housemaid who was assigned to maintain Verity's rooms, a girl named Dora who was 17, and direct in the way of people who have not yet learned that directness is considered a liability, brought her a cup of tea on the second morning and said cheerfully, "Everyone's wondering what you're doing here, miss, but Mrs. Bramley told Cook you were going to sort the Eastern accounts, and Cook says if you can do that, she'll have no complaints." The others were more cautious in their welcome. The estate secretary, Mr. Farrow, was a man of 40 who had held the administrative position for 11 years, and who looked at Verity's presence with the particular expression of a man reassessing the boundaries of his own territory. He was not overtly hostile. He was precise and correct and slightly slower to share information than the situation required. Verity noted this and made no comment. She asked him for specific documents through specific channels and gave him no reason to deny the requests. The first external complication arrived in the 2nd week. Lord Harwick, who held the adjacent estate and a significant portion of the Crestwood drainage easement agreements, called formally in December and was shown into the library, where Verity happened to be working. He looked at her across the table with the mild surprise of a man encountering a cat in a room where he expected only furniture. He said to Julian, "I wasn't aware you'd hired a—" and he did not finish the sentence, because Julian said simply, "Miss Ashworth is reviewing the easement documentation. She will be at the meeting." Lord Harwick had looked at Verity with the recalibrating expression of a man who is revising a category. He said to her, "And what are your conclusions thus far, Miss Ashworth?" She had said, "I believe the diversion clause from the 1803 agreement is the origin of the current dispute. I have the original document if you'd like to review it." She had produced it. He had read it in silence for a moment and then said, slowly, "I'll be damned." Not to her, to the paper. She had returned to her notes. The second complication was personal, and arrived in the form of a visitor. Miss Elaine Whitmore called at Crestwood Hall in the 3rd week of December, accompanied by her mother, on the pretext of returning a book that had been lent to her at some earlier point. She was shown into the drawing room, where Julian received visitors of a social nature. She was beautiful in the particular way of women who have been arranged to be beautiful. Her gown was precisely right, her hair managed to perfection, her manner calibrated to the exact frequency of gracious availability. Verity encountered her in the corridor outside the drawing room. She had not intended to encounter her at all. She was on her way to the estate accounts room with a set of ledgers under her arm, when Miss Whitmore emerged from the direction of the drawing room to find some forgotten item. She looked at Verity with the particular assessment of a woman who has arrived to find the landscape has changed in ways she was not told about. She said pleasantly, "You must be the new estate assistant." Verity said, "I manage the estate accounts, yes." Miss Whitmore said, with the precision of someone placing a pin, "A considerable responsibility for a woman. You must have extensive family connection here to have been trusted with it." Verity said, "No family connection. The Duke employed me on the basis of my record at Ashworth Park. If you'll excuse me." She shifted the ledgers under her arm and continued down the corridor. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not the rustle of a returned step, not a comment to her companion. Only a pause, long enough to register, and then Miss Whitmore's heels on the hall floor going the other direction. Verity set the ledgers on the accounts room table and opened the first one. She had managed the wool merchant who had tried to insert a fraudulent clause into a contract. She could manage a drawing room. The private accumulation began quietly, the way things accumulate when no one is performing them. The library had become, by the third week, the room where they both naturally arrived in the morning. He did not invite her there explicitly each day. She did not wait to be invited. There was work that required two people. The drainage mapping, the tenant ledger reconciliation, the letters that needed both legal precision and estate knowledge. And they did it together at the large table, and the work organized the time, and the time organized something else. On the evening of the fourth Thursday, she had been alone in the library past 9 o'clock, working through a set of correspondence that had arrived from the Yorkshire wool merchant with a new query about the recovered margin clause. She had not noticed the hour. She noticed it now because the fire had burned down, and the room had grown cold, and she was still working, and her hands had grown stiff. The door opened without announcement, and Julian entered, carrying a second lamp. He looked at the cold fireplace. He did not comment on the hour. He crossed to the fireplace, rebuilt the fire with the efficiency of a man who has done practical things with his own hands, and then returned to the table and sat in the chair opposite hers. He said, "There's a new offer from the wool merchant. I received a copy this afternoon." She said, "I read it. He's renegotiating from a position he thinks is stronger than it is, because he believes the recovered margin clause is open to counter-argument. It isn't. The language is settled." Julian said, "I know. I wanted to confirm we agreed before I responded." She looked at him across the table. He was looking at the wool merchant's letter, not at her. His coat was on the chair beside him, not on his shoulders, which she had come to understand was the posture he adopted when he was done performing precision and was simply working. She said, "The cravat is crooked. It has been since this afternoon." He looked at her. She said, not looking up from her notes, 40 minutes at least." There was a silence. Then he reached up, without self-consciousness, and straightened it by touch. She watched him fail to fix it properly. She set her pen down, stood, crossed to where he sat, and adjusted it with 6 efficient movements of her fingers, and stepped back. He was very still for the full duration of this. When she stepped back, he did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She returned to her side of the table. She picked up her pen. Her hand was entirely steady. She had not learned in 28 years how to name the specific sensation of mending a thing for someone who had let you. It was not tenderness, not exactly. It was something older and quieter than that, like the recognition of a form you had always known how to hold. She returned to the wool merchant's letter. The following evening she was not in the library. She was in the east corridor, which led past the room that had been the late Duchess's sitting room, and which Verity had not entered. The door was slightly ajar. She had passed it 12 times in 3 weeks and had not gone in. She went in now because the lamp she carried showed, through the gap in the door, a pianoforte, a better maintained instrument than Aunt Helena's, though the bench had the particular patina of something not recently used. She sat and played. She played the pieces she had played in Ashworth's East drawing room. Not all of them, just the ones that required attention, the ones that rewarded precision. She did not hear the door open further. She did not know, until she had finished and turned, that Julian was standing in the doorway. He had been there, she estimated from his stillness, for some time. She said, "I apologize. I should have asked." He said, "No." The word was quieter than his usual tone. "That was my mother's pianoforte. She played that piece. The last one." Verity sat with this. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "It's a beautiful composition." He said, "She composed it herself, when I was about 12. She turned back to the keys. She played it again, once, from the beginning. He did not speak during it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He said, from the doorway, "I didn't know anyone else knew it." She said, "I didn't know it had a composer. I found it in the East drawing room at Ashworth, in a box of music. Someone must have copied it." He stood in the doorway for another moment. He said, "Good night, Miss Ashworth." She said, "Good night, Your Grace." He left. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and then rose and went back to the accounts room and wrote 4 notes in the margin of the drainage agreement document, because there was work to be done and she was going to do it, and there was no use in sitting very still in a room where something had just happened that she did not yet have the word for. What she had was a ledger and a task, and the discipline she had built over 16 years of being the person who kept things standing. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work. The formal investor meeting was scheduled for the second Friday of January, 1820. It was, though Julian did not explain this to Verity initially, the most consequential meeting the Crestwood estate had faced in 5 years. She understood the full shape of it when she received, 1 week before the meeting, the complete history of the Eastern tenancy drainage agreements, the Harwick easement documentation, and a ledger that she had not previously had access to, the investment account maintained by the Crestwood Estate Board, which consisted of Julian's father's surviving trustees and 3 allied family investors who held minority interests in the agricultural operation. She read it in one evening. Then she sat with what she had read. The Eastern tenancy problem was not a drafting error. She had suspected this. She had not, until now, seen the full architecture of it. Beginning in 1812, 3 years after Julian had begun the estate reconstruction, a sequence of easement agreements and tenancy renewal clauses had been structured in a way that siphoned recovered agricultural margin into a secondary account nominally held for estate improvement. The improvement account had not been used for improvement. Its primary disbursement was to the 2 board members who had originated the restructuring in 1812, a man named Mr. Gerald Tice and Lord Harwick. Gerald Tice, who had attended Sir Mortimer's dinner, who had arrived in Julian's carriage. She sat very still for 4 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and began making a chart. By the time she had finished, 3 hours later, she had documented, through cross-referencing the investment account with the estate improvement ledger and the original easement documents, the extraction of approximately £3,200 over 8 years, not stolen by the standards the law easily recognized, extracted through the accumulation of agreed-upon clauses that no one had been watching in aggregate. The kind of extraction that requires a person to hold the whole picture at once to see it clearly. The kind that does not survive being looked at. She had it on 7 pages of organized, cross-referenced notes. She brought the notes to Julian the following morning. He read them without speaking. She stood on the other side of the table and watched him read, and she knew from the particular quality of his stillness, not his working stillness, but a different thing, tighter, like armor rusting beneath a coat, that he had suspected some portion of this without yet having the proof. When he finished, he said, "Tice," she said, and Harwick, though Harwick's participation is technically arguable. The easement structure benefits him, but he may not have known the full design. Tice is the one who drafted the improvement account clauses. His name is on the original incorporation document. She pointed to the relevant page. Here. Julian looked at the page. He said, "How long would this take to present formally?" She said, "If I have the board's complete correspondence file for 1812 through 1815, I can have the full documentation prepared in 4 days." He said, "You'll have it within the hour." The meeting assembled in the Crestwood Library on a Friday morning in January, with all the architecture of formal financial inquiry. 6 men seated at the long table, the board's correspondence file opened, Julian at the head, and Verity, who had been introduced by Julian as the estate accounts manager, without elaboration, without apology, seated at the table's side with 7 pages of organized documentation and the original easement documents laid flat before her. Mr. Gerald Tice had arrived looking at ease. He was a man of about 55, well-dressed, with the comfortable confidence of someone who believes the room is organized in his favor. He had glanced at Verity when she was introduced and said, to Julian, pleasantly, "Is your accounts manager presenting today, Crestwood? I wasn't aware we'd be including administrative staff in the board discussion." Julian said, "Miss Ashworth has documentation relevant to the agenda. She will present it." Tice had settled back. He was patient. He was, Verity understood, a man who had managed rooms like this before. She stood. She did not begin with the conclusion. She began with 1812 and the original improvement account document, and she proceeded in chronological order through 8 years of a mechanism that had been structured to be invisible unless you held all of it at once and knew where to look. She was specific. She cited the document numbers and the page numbers and the corresponding ledger entries. She did not editorialize. She did not argue. She presented. Lord Harwick, who was in the room, had gone very quiet by the 3rd document. Mr. Tice had begun with moderate precision, clarifying a term here, noting an interpretive issue there, and then, by the 5th page, with the specific August 1814 disbursement entry placed beside the improvement account's corresponding outgoing figure, and the correspondence letter in Tice's own hand specifying the disbursement category, he had stopped clarifying. The room did not erupt when she finished. There was a long moment, like a held breath, like a note played and then released, in which no one spoke. Then one of the other board members, a man named Mr. Collier, who was 70 and had been on the estate board since Julian's father's time, said, in a very measured voice, "Tice." Tice said nothing. Verity returned to her chair. Her hands were steady. They had been steady throughout. Julian stood. He said, "The board will take a recess. I will speak privately with Mr. Tice. When we reconvene, I'll propose the recovery structure." He looked at Verity for one moment, just one, and then turned to address the room. "Miss Ashworth's documentation is complete and will be provided to each member in full. Any questions about the methodology should go to her directly." It was, Verity noted afterward, the first time she had been formally named as the source of a thing she had actually done. The recess lasted 35 minutes. When they reconvened, Mr. Tice was not in the room. Lord Harwick was. He sat through the remainder of the meeting with the compressed expression of a man who is calculating what is survivable, and when the recovery structure was agreed upon, he said, to no one in particular, staring at the table. I was given to understand the improvement account was standard. I should have reviewed the originating documents. He did not look at Verity when he said this. He did not apologize. But it was the first time, in Verity's experience of him, that he had acknowledged that a thing she had identified was real. She did not say anything in response. She wrote the final note in her documentation and closed the file. The room had changed. Julian found her in the accounts room in the late afternoon, after the board had dispersed. She was writing the summary of the meeting's resolution into the estate record, properly, with specificity, with attribution. She was going to ensure this was documented correctly. He entered and closed the door behind him, which he had not done before. He said, "Tice will not contest the recovery. He has been advised that the documentation leaves no viable alternative." She said, "No, it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to speak to you about something that is separate from the estate." She set her pen down. She turned to look at him. He was standing near the door, very still, with his coat on for once, as though he had dressed for a specific occasion. He said, "The board meeting required a formal structure. The documentation you produced required a named author who holds a recognized position. I told the board you were the estate accounts manager." "That was accurate as far as it went," she said. "As far as it went," he said. "I have been asked, I will be asked, what your position here is, in terms the law recognizes, and in terms that protect what you have built here from being dismissed by any subsequent challenge." She was very still. He said, "The most complete answer to that question is one that I am aware is not conventional, and that comes at cost to you in ways I have considered, and that I would not ask you to take without." He paused, in the way of a man who rarely pauses. "I proposed to Sir Mortimer 3 months ago. He accepted the proposal on terms I considered his to accept or decline, but I did not ask you." Verity looked at him. She said, "You proposed to my uncle." He said, "I proposed the match, yes. It was the formal requirement, but I am asking you." She sat with this for a moment that was exactly as long as it needed to be. She said, "Why?" He said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the only person I have encountered who holds the full picture and goes on working regardless, and because you played my mother's composition in a dark room without knowing it was hers, and because you straightened my cravat and did not make a thing of it, and because when I look at this estate now, I see your mind in it. Those are not grounds the law requires. They are the ones I have." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the accounts on the table, and the 7 pages of documentation that had reorganized a room full of powerful men, and the window beyond which Crestwood's grounds were covered in January light, and she thought, with the full, unhurried precision she brought to every decision, about what she was being offered, and what it would cost, and what she would build. Then she said, "Yes." He crossed the room. He took her hand. She had removed her gloves to work, and he held it for a moment in both of his, and then he brought it to his lips. It was the most formal gesture he had made toward her, and it was also, she understood, the most sincere. She said, "The recovery documentation needs to be filed with the county solicitor before Friday." He said, "I know." She said, "I'll have it ready by Wednesday." He said, "I know." They stood there, in the accounts room, in the late winter light, with the estate records on the table between them and the whole of what had been built visible in the organized pages. And it was not a fairy story. It was something more durable than that, like a well-built bridge, tested by what had crossed it, holding. The notice of their engagement provoked, in the social world around Crestwood Hall, the precise response Verity had anticipated: surprise first, recalibration second, and then the structured reluctance of people who do not wish to oppose a duke directly, but wish him to understand that the decision is irregular. Julian's father's eldest surviving advisor, a man named Mr. Alderton, who had known the family for 40 years, called in the third week of January. He was shown into Julian's library, where Verity was also present, because Julian had not suggested she leave, and she had not suggested it herself. Alderton was a man of 70, precise and upright, who looked at Verity with the particular expression of someone who finds himself revising a category. He said to Julian, "It is an unusual choice, Crestwood. No one disputes that the young woman has been useful, but the dukedom requires," Julian said, "the dukedom requires exactly what Miss Ashworth possesses. She has demonstrated that beyond dispute in the past 6 weeks. If you have a specific objection to the match, I will hear it." Alderton had looked at Verity. He had looked at the board documentation on the table, a copy of it, which remained on the estate library table as a working reference. He had looked back at Julian. He said slowly, "The Tice matter, that was her analysis." Julian said, "Entirely." Alderton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said to Verity, directly, which she noted, "The improvement account disbursements go back to 1812. How long did it take you to assemble the full picture?" She said, 4 days for the complete documentation. I identified the structural pattern on the first evening." He sat with that. He said, "1 evening." She said, "The mechanism was legible once you held all the records at once. The difficulty was that no one had held them all at once before." Alderton was quiet. Then he said, "I see." It was not approval, it was not warmth, but he left the library without renewing his objection, and in the weeks that followed, when the engagement was publicly announced, and the social machinery generated its whispers and its careful opinions, Alderton did not add his voice to them. It was, Verity understood, the most she could expect from a man of his position and his time, and she found it sufficient. She was not going to count on things that merely looked like conversion. They were married in April, at the Crestwood Estate Church, in a ceremony that was small by ducal standards, and exactly the right size by Verity's. Mrs. Bramley sat in the second row and cried with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who considers crying a practical response to important occasions and gets on with it. Dora, the young housemaid, had pressed Verity's wedding gown with an attention to the cuff detail that Verity noticed and would remember. The woman who stood beside Verity in the vestry before the service was Charlotte Farrow, no relation to the estate secretary, a woman of 30 who had been introduced to Verity by Mrs. Bramley as a neighbor who would call, and who had arrived one afternoon in February and sat in the morning room and said, with the directness of someone who has decided to skip the introductory stages, "I've heard you dismantled Gerald Tice with a set of ledgers and 7 pages. I think we should be friends." Verity had said, "The ledgers did most of it." Charlotte had said, "They always say that, the good ones." Charlotte stood beside her in the vestry and said, "You're going to be a duchess before noon." Verity said, "I'm aware." Charlotte said, "How do you feel?" Verity said, "Ready." Charlotte smiled, and it was the smile of someone who believes what they are told when the person telling them means it completely. The older man in the third row, silver-haired, formal, with the bearing of a man who has spent 50 years being useful in precise ways, was Mr. Edmund Royce, the retired diplomatic attaché who had served on the Eastern Counties Land Commission and who had, in the January negotiations, quietly provided Julian with the specific administrative pathway through which the Tice recovery could be processed without becoming a scandal that damaged the whole board. He had done this without fanfare and had said to Verity, when they met, that he had reviewed her drainage documentation and considered it the clearest account analysis he had seen in 12 years of commission work. This was not a compliment he appeared to give easily, and she received it accordingly. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. This was a thing Verity had known for 16 years, and standing at the front of the church in April while the assembled small gathering rose, she felt, with the quiet precision that characterized everything she did, that she was not being overlooked now. The Duke, standing at the front of the church, was looking at her in the way he had looked at her in the accounts room and the library and the music room, not with performance, not with the arranged attention of a man fulfilling a role, but with the specific, total attention of a person who has found something he has been looking for and intends to keep looking at it. She walked up the aisle at a measured pace. She did not rush. The private moment had already happened. The night before the wedding, he had knocked on the door of the East Wing sitting room where she was reading over the post-meeting recovery documentation one final time, not because it needed reviewing, but because precision was how she honored things that mattered. He had entered when she said to enter, and he had sat in the chair opposite her and said, "I want to say something that is not in any document." She had looked up. He had said, "You could have said no. January, in the accounts room. You had every reason to say no. The terms were unusual. The proposal was unconventional. The path forward had no reliable precedent. I know what I was asking." She had said, "I know what I was accepting." He had said, "I know, that's what I wanted to say. You assessed it and you chose it, not me, or not only me. The whole thing. You chose it knowing all of it." She had been very still for a moment. Then she had said, "When I was 23 and the creditor letters were on the desk and everything could have gone wrong, I made a decision. I decided I was going to survive what I was given, and I was going to do it without becoming less than I was. That's the decision I have been living inside for 5 years." She had looked at him. She had said, "What you offered me in January was a life that is equal to what I am, not because you arranged it to be, but because you looked at what I was and did not look away. I have been waiting for someone to look at me completely." He had said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, "I looked at you from the beginning. I'm going to keep looking." She had nodded once, with the considered completeness she brought to all her answers, and picked up her pen and returned to the recovery documentation, and he had sat in the chair opposite her for another hour while she worked, and neither of them spoke, and it was exactly what she would have chosen. The life they built afterward was specific and warm and occasionally loud. The Eastern Tenancy drainage scheme was resolved by August, with a recovery structure that redistributed the extracted margin to the affected tenant farmers across 4 years of adjusted agreements. The documentation Verity produced for this was adopted as a precedent by the County Land Commission. Mr. Royce wrote to her to say that 3 neighboring estates had requested copies of the analysis framework she had used, and he would like to know if she would consent to its being used as a model for commission training. She wrote back to say yes, with some additional annotations she thought might be useful. The Crestwood estate accounts, under her management, were reconstructed from the ground up over the following 2 years. She implemented a ledger system with cross-referencing standards she had developed first at Ashworth Park and then refined at Crestwood, a system that made the kind of gradual extraction Tice had managed essentially illegible by design. Lord Harwick, upon receiving the new easement terms in November, had signed them without objection. He had not apologized. He had, on one occasion in the spring, when she had encountered him at a county function, acknowledged her with a specific precision, a nod that meant something slightly more than courtesy, and said, "The new drainage structure is working. The eastern fields are producing." She had said, "I expect they will continue to." He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she had learned to read as the particular look of a man who has had to revise a category and has done it, privately and imperfectly, without announcing it. Then he had moved on. It was, again, the most she expected, and she found it exactly sufficient. Miss Elaine Whitmore married a baronet from Northamptonshire in the summer of 1820. The marriage was, by all social accounts, appropriate and pleasant, and Verity heard about it from Charlotte, who reported it without malice, and Verity received the information with equal equanimity. Miss Whitmore had not been her enemy. She had been the form the world prepared for women of a certain kind, and she had done nothing wrong by inhabiting it. The world had simply, in this one case, organized itself differently. The professional legacy took root in a way that Verity had not entirely planned. The commission training model was formally adopted in 1821. The revised Crestwood lease agreements became a standard referenced in county solicitor practice. And the annotated accounts record, 12 volumes cross-referenced, with her methodology notes in the margins, was maintained in the Crestwood Estate Library, where it would be consulted for the next 40 years by estate managers, solicitors, and one land reformer who would, in 1847, cite it in a parliamentary briefing. Her name was on it, clearly, specifically on the title page. Verity, Duchess of Crestwood, née Ashworth, compiled from the estate records, 1820 to 1834, with notes. Their son arrived in February 1821, announced with the cheerful efficiency of a child who has decided the question of arrival and does not require further discussion. They named him Edmund, for Mr. Royce, who had been precise and useful and asked for nothing, and also because it suited him, which they discovered immediately and did not question. He had Julian's stillness and Verity's attention, and by the age of 3 was bringing her things from the writing desk to examine, turning them over in his small hands with the focused curiosity of a person who believes objects have explanations. He had learned this from watching her. It was a Thursday morning in March, 4 years into the life they had built, when Julian found her in the library, not at the large table, but in the window alcove, where Edmund had fallen asleep against her arm in a shaft of spring light, while she was reading him what was nominally a nursery rhyme, but had gradually become the opening of the recovery documentation, because it was what she had in hand, and he had not complained. She had kept reading until he fell asleep, and then she had remained very still so as not to wake him, and she was in that stillness when Julian entered. He stood in the library doorway and looked at her. She looked up. She said quietly, "He fell asleep on the boring part." Julian said, "The drainage clauses." She said, "The 1812 improvement account preamble." He crossed the room without noise and sat beside her in the alcove and looked at Edmund, who was deeply and completely asleep, with all the commitment a 3-year-old brings to sleep. Julian put his hand very carefully against the back of the child's head, which was the particular gesture, unhurried, unperformed, that she had come to understand was how he expressed the things he did not say. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. She did not make a thing of it. He did not move. Outside the library window, the Crestwood grounds were coming into their spring arrangement, the grounds that she had walked and mapped and understood and loved in the way she loved everything she understood, completely, specifically, with full attention. He was watching her. She knew he was watching her, in the way she had always known the things that mattered, with the quiet certainty of a person who has learned that being seen completely is the only gift worth having. She turned one more page of the document and continued reading.